All right, I've got Kim Thomas and Faith Ramasco here, and we are going to do this one on video so that you can see our lovely faces. I'm just getting over a cold, so I just wanted to show people that I'm alive and well. How is everybody else doing?
Good.
I'm
Doing
doing
good.
okay today.
Good? Yeah. We've had some rough news this week, and I think we wanted to talk about how people are feeling. This is coming after a lot of other transitions and things have happened. Kim, you want to sort of give us the overview for people who maybe are wanting to have some context?
Sure. This week we lost some team members in IT. And when I say that, we lost a lot of good people in IT. And they are people, a lot of them have been around for a long time. Some are newer to the organization, but they've all been very great contributors to our mission and IT, I would say. With that, we have had, we've gone, this is our second round. There was some folks that were let go in July, and there's a lot of grief associated with that. And really, I kind of want to talk about the broader grief of just where this organization has been over the last 3 years. And because for some people that are newer, they may not have seen that this grief that a lot of people are experiencing right now, it's kind of a pattern right now. And as a pattern of, when I say a pattern, it's just continual grieving. And at the same time, there's a lot of things to celebrate. But I think we as humans tend to ignore the grief or set the grief aside and focus on all of the good things. And there are great things to focus on. But for healing and for people here at Common Spirit that either are new, whether they've came from Catholic Health Initiative or Dignity Health and are now Common Spirit employees, there has been grief. It's been a season of grief. And I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I've been around for over a year now, but I came from a place where they were also experiencing a lot of loss, right? And I think even people who maybe haven't been around as long, if they recently came to Common Spirit, they were coming probably from places that were experiencing a lot of transition as well in the last few years. So everybody, I think, to some extent understands the type of grief that everyone's been dealing with. But it is also to come into a new work environment and experience sort of meeting after meeting that's sort of a downer. You want to believe that it's not always going to be like that, So Faith, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how everybody's sort of experienced this grief over the last few years because of the pandemic. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways that we experience grief. Sometimes we experience grief in the form of fear of change, because we know that change might mean loss. Sometimes we experience collective grief, where that's maybe impacting a community or a team. And then there's this kind of global sense of grief or broader sense of grief of a whole city, a whole town, a whole nation, a whole globe experiences something that means loss for everybody in different ways, whether that's loss of people or loss of opportunity or loss of what was known. And what we know neurobiologically to be true about grief is that when you feel it in one place, it reminds you of all the other times and places that you've experienced grief. And so it gets linked. We've had across the pandemic a global experience of grief, watching things close to us and far away and everything in between have to shift and adjust. There's the grief of people that have been lost. There's the grief of jobs that have been lost, of things that have changed, people who missed graduations or weddings. There's also the grief of what it's meant to do that as healthcare IT, to be on the ground every day, to be engaging not just with our own personal experiences of grief, but then engaging with other people who are grieving as well, who are in the middle of this. And all grief pulls on the thread of all the other grief that we feel. And so when organizations go through big change, there's, a lot of questions about what loss, what might be lost, what are we afraid of losing, what matters most, what grief reminds us of the echoes of all the other places of grief, what grief have we not felt fully, and so it's just waiting underneath of another form of grief for us to process or feel or engage with, or it gets brought up all of a sudden, even if it's weeks or months later. Grief is not this linear line. And so, for some who worked through the pandemic on the ground in hospitals, there might be things now where you're really coming to realize the grief as we're working through a very different kind of loss, and the loss of team members through transition and change.
Mm-hmm.
So throughout the time that we've done the podcast, we've often sort of alluded to or talked about the effects of the pandemic on EUS and common spirit. And I was asking Faith before we started recording, like, how long are we going to have to talk about it? I know, I don't think I'm alone in feeling like, man, I'm just tired of, there was a time where we were all tired of masks or whatever, or we were tired of social distancing, or we were tired of all these different precautions that we had to take, and we did it because it was necessary. And some of us are still doing it because it's necessary, definitely in the hospital environments. And it gets exhausting, right? But it's also exhausting just to talk about to use the word over and over, and I was asking you, Faith, how long are we going to have to sort of open up that box of trauma,
Yeah.
And you told me what?
I mean, the rest of our lives are going to be impacted by it in the way that generations before us are reminiscent of the Great Depression, the influenza pandemic of 1918, the way that some generations talk about World War II. It's not on the same scale, right, as those things, but it's a collective experience that we've gone through that creates collective grief. And what you're describing is there's grief that we feel that is like really sharp in the moment. We might feel like, oh, this is painful, and I feel it right now. I feel it as it's happening. I feel the weight of it. Oftentimes people talk about feeling stuck in their bodies feeling like they're stuck in quicksand, or their hands are cemented, or they are trying to run, but they can't get anywhere. And what we've seen through the pandemic is a lot of research that talks about languishing, which is not necessarily this, I am in the moment, I'm feeling the full weight of what's happening. And it's not a full activation and like I'm able to move forward. There's this middle space of like, I'm just so tired and I don't feel good and I don't feel bad. I feel blah. I feel overwhelmed by the amount of change that's coming. I feel overwhelmed by how much or the rate or the pace of it. And it's easier for me to just kind of provide space for my own survival to check out a little bit and to push it away, which is, not just pandemic, but often what happens when companies, businesses, workplace communities go through a lot of change, that sometimes there's a posture that can come into play of like, just like wake me up when September ends, right? um, and I think as I'm reflecting on the week that we've had and the last couple of months that we've had and the last couple of years that this organization has had, when you add that to the pandemic, there's just a compounding layer, and also a continual need to build resilience beyond what we've ever had to build that capacity for in some situations before, right? That there's that also widening of the window. And so I think like what Kim was saying, and just touching base with the change that's continued to come, and we have an opportunity to be mindful of naming what it is that we're experiencing so that we can master it. We talk about things so we can move through them, right?
Name it to tame it, right?
Name it to tame it, right? To move through them. And so one of the best things that we can do is not putting over a layer of false positivity, like Kim was saying so often we do, right? But to say like, this is the reality, and collectively we're experiencing it. So collectively, let's find the best way to move through this. And when I don't have strength, maybe you do. And when you have strength, maybe I don't. And let's lock arms with one another to move through this, especially in a time where there's uncertainty. Uncertainty brings up all kinds of things for us.
I wanted to start sort of big and talk about, the pandemic, which is obviously sort of universal. And I want to get back to talking about the relationships, which I think is the most important thing. But one thing that I haven't talked a whole lot with people about is sort of mourning the loss of our individual company or enterprise cultures as we're sort of merging and creating something new. I think all of us want to focus on the positive and on the opportunities, but like Kim, there's got to be some part of you that, loves Dignity Health, and you still are a Dignity Health person, on some level, right? Like, how do you have any sort of grief around the loss of that smaller culture into sort of a larger culture?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's I could talk for 3 hours on that. There's a lot of grief associated with Dignity Health. And I think I'll step back for a second and just kind of talk about the merger. These two companies came together because they had similar values. Their mission was same, very aligned. And, Kevin and Lloyd worked very hard with sisters and a lot of people to make create common spirit, and a lot went into it. And the merger was very, very exciting. And so for those of you that don't know, and I think a lot of people know, but some don't, when this company first came together, before we were actually officially merged, it merged in February, but we were supposed to merge at the end of December. But in January, we had a kickoff event in Las Vegas. And this event included all the VPs and above, a lot of directors and above, managers, some managers and some individual contributors as well. And it was big. When I say it was big, we rented out like a theater in Vegas, and we had our ELT on stage. We had Jewel came and sang. We all lit candles and came together in a very spiritual sense of bringing these organizations together. The sisters were on stage. I mean, it was a big deal. And I think everyone left, or a lot of people left, very, very hopeful and very excited for the future. And I know I was excited for the merger. I mean, yes, it was a little scary. Yeah, it was a little scary, but it was as a leader, it was really cool to be a part of. I would tell you it was one of the highlights of my career being in that room when we formed this company. And it was great. And then as we started moving forward with integration, and you integrate companies and you need to do cost savings and all those things happen, and it's like the nature of running the business. And there were things CHI was better at that we adopted at Dignity Health. There are things that Dignity Health was better that CHI adopted. And it was one of the things I realized right away is that the people were fantastic. Like the people at CHI were just like people at Dignity Health. I mean, they're great people. And coming in and forming this great new company was amazing. But there was a lot of work. There was a lot of work ahead of us, a lot of hard work, a lot of, like I was saying, cost savings measures and things like that, but a lot of best practices as well. So we were about, a little over a year into that when the pandemic hit and everything stopped. And so it was chaotic, obviously, pandemic. I mean, if I sum up, just being in healthcare and IT during the beginning of the pandemic, it was so hard. And it was, but we came together as an IT organization because of the pandemic. Like we had to work together. It forced
no other choice. Yeah.
It forced us to get things done that would have taken years had we had financial constraints or regulatory constraints. There was a lot of things that were made simpler because it was an emergency. So, and then we got Zoom, and then people started getting to know each other on Zoom. And honestly, the relationships I formed during the pandemic are just as strong as the relationships I had before, so that was beautiful. But it also stopped other things. It stopped progress of moving the infrastructure as one. And there are other things that stopped, and things got more complex and harder. Then we ran into financial difficulties, and then that got harder. And a lot of people during this 2-year span left our organization. And I realized, probably it was actually about a year ago, that I was so buried with work. I had so much going on that I had just lost my joy. Like I did not have joy, and there was several events that led up to that, but I realized it, and I was like, something's got to change, because that is who I am, and I need that to go forward. And I was sitting in the Phoenix data center for the first time since the pandemic, and it was at Dwayne Paul's going away lunch. And I was there for some meetings, and I was fortunate enough to be able to schedule it when he was there. And I've worked with Dwayne for more than 20 years. And I was sitting in one of the conference rooms, and I just kind of looked out, and I walked by, and, normally that place pre-pandemic was just hustle and bustle all the time. There's very few people in there, but there was a room at the top of the stairs on the second floor, Ocotillo, and that room is always full of, it's always full. There's always a meeting in there. There's usually a lot of, VPs and just directors and people that are working on projects. And I walked by that room, and I saw Jim Coughlin, and I've worked with him for a long time. And I also saw Sunil Levi, and I saw a whole bunch of people that were relatively new. And none of the people I would have worked with at Dignity Health, except for Jim. And I kind of walked by, and I went back to the conference room I was in, and I thought, it's okay. It's okay. We've got great new talent. And I bring up Sunila. Sunila had to leave us in July. So, you see new great people come in, and even some new great people have left. So you look at that, and you just see, okay. And I had said to Leah back in a year ago, I think part of the problem is we're grieving what used to be. But we're not grieving what used to be. We just ignored what used to be. and embraced the new common spirit. And it was full of a pandemic, and it was full of leadership changes. It was full of your best friends leaving and everything else. And we did not pause to recognize that this is loss.
Mhm.
And we have to, if we're going to move forward.
Yeah.
And I think with every single one of these events that's happened, and, I was glad to hear Elizabeth say that for now, like she thinks that this is behind us in IT for now. Obviously, just like she said, could never promise that there won't be other changes in the future, but there's been a lot of heavy lifting and hard work in the last 4 or 5 months to get us back on track. I mean, I think everybody knows it's been pretty transparent. We've been very transparent that we've been in financial difficulty, and IT has overspent, and we've needed to make really hard decisions to be viable. And I will say, it's not easy making those decisions. And I mean, I wasn't part of either of these. But, I saw my leader on a call 2 days ago break down at the beginning of the call. And that's okay. And I think we have such a culture, and I say we, I mean, like North America, we have such a culture of saying, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. It's going to be fine. Move on. We've got other good people. And I mean, even, I talk to if I make a complaint to my mother, I promise you, she's going to be like, oh, so many people have it so much worse. Yes, of course, people have it worse, but that doesn't mean that my grief isn't real or your grief isn't real. And I think people need to sit in their grief and realize that when we providing words of comfort in a time of pain sometimes doesn't come across as comfort. It comes across as like, you're not seeing me in my pain. You're not hearing me in my pain. And I know that for me this week, I've had a couple of leaders on my mind, pretty constant, and prayers for them. Because not all grief is, grief is the same. I mean, some people are mourning the fact that they lost their job this week. Other people are mourning the fact that they lost their team, or, a lot of different, or I had to do this, I mean, these SVPs that had to have these conversations this week, that's hard. It's brutal.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody ever wants to have that conversation. So there's a lot of grief in different spaces that I think, and all of it's valid. I mean, I will tell you right now, if I lost my team, I can't even imagine more grief than that.
Faith, I think a lot of people are feeling right now some amount of loss and don't know how to deal with it, right? And I feel like you, with your background, might have some strategies for dealing with this type of grief. So how do we move forward, I guess, with after, some of us might be feeling guilt, some of us might be feeling grief and loss or shame or any number of things based on
Sure.
the current events. How do we move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things is that when we experience collective grief, our response to it is collective as well. And so holding space for one another and just being able to name it to each other, to yourself, as many times as you need. It's not enough for us to just say, I feel sad about this, and then we're done. Every time that grief or that whatever feeling comes with the grief rises up to say, I'm feeling this, is a huge part of continuing to overcome the obstacle. Another piece is that I've been through organizations that go through processes like this before, and there's often a sense of those who have come through adaptive change scenarios like this and are still with the organization, oftentimes there's a sense of like, I'm really thankful that I'm still here, and a sense of feeling maybe guilty for still being able, like when we lose somebody, sometimes survivors feel really guilty that they're alive and someone else is not, right? And we haven't lost people in that way, but there can be a sense in an organization of like, well, now I'm here and I'm gonna, give it my all, and that's good. Those things are good. We just have to also recognize that they're coming from a place of grief, of responding to the grief, and naming it will help us adjust by 40% the activity that's happening internally for ourselves. The other piece is to really press into self-care. Oftentimes when we experience hard things, depending on your, personality or your particular proclivities, or we experience stressful things, our response is to save time by cutting out the self-care first, when really the things that help bring our joy back, like Kim was talking about, are those very activities. So this is an opportunity to press in when you are noticing you have a day where you are experiencing a lot, or there's somebody you used to work with that you would ping and say, hey, I need help with this, and they're not there to ping anymore. To acknowledge that and make a plan for how you're going to give 10 minutes of self-care in addition to whatever that thing might be for you for the day.
Kim, Faith was just saying, that's, you got to figure out how to, instead of pulling away from the things that brought you joy, you need actually to push back into those things. I think, if I'm understanding correctly, Faith, like when you were saying that you realized that you'd sort of lost the joy, like how did you get that back? Do you have that back? I hope you do.
I definitely have it back. I mean, weeks like this are hard, but there's like still an underlining joy I have, like for the organization and for each other that kind of propels me through. Yeah, a couple of things I did. Sometimes I give credit to TikTok because TikTok's really funny and it makes me laugh and it gets joy from that, but that really wasn't it. I realized that I had gotten so bogged down in the busy that I was neglecting myself entirely. And so with that, and there was a couple of things that led up to that. One, I'd made this giant mistake, and I'm just not somebody that typically makes mistakes like the mistake I made. And I made this mistake because I just didn't have a spare moment to think about it. And if I hadn't had 20 things going on at the same time, it wouldn't have happened, but I did. And I realized I'm working at this pace that is just, it's not sustainable. And so I made some intentional shifts. One, I'm a Christian. I think it's important for me to spend time in my spiritual practices. And I had let that go. Like I had foregone my morning routine to instead immediately pick up my phone and do email. So I re-implemented that. I would take, instead of I try to do email in bulk instead of filling every spare moment with email. That's a big one for me. My poor team will sometimes get a boatload of emails from me on a Thursday night, but it's because I didn't do email during the day in between little tiny meetings. And I mean, some people, I may get in trouble for saying that. I don't know, but my job is for the people. It's not to sit and read email all day long. And so I really had to prioritize email in 2 chunks. And I would say the same thing goes for chat. There was just an overload of things happening. And I was like, no, slow down. I'm going to slow down. I'm going to prioritize the things that are important. I mean, I even told Leah, you might not get as fast a response from me as you have become accustomed to, because I usually just drop everything and deal with it. And I said, but I have to change this in order to bring that joy back around. And I will also say that the greatest part of my job is sitting with my team
Mhm.
Without a doubt, it's coaching the team. I had a conversation this morning with a team member, and I get fueled from that and giving back to other people. So I need to make time for that and less time for spreadsheets.
Well, and I've heard from multiple people, and I've seen like that you being around your team brings you a lot of happiness. You really enjoy it. And so I would imagine that some of the travel restrictions and that kind of stuff really put a kink in that for a while and made it harder for you to enjoy that aspect of your job too.
Definitely. Like I refer back to that moment in Phoenix sitting in the conference room. I hadn't been there in 2 years and I was usually there once a month. So it was all very surreal.
Sure.
But yeah, not being able to be on the ground with the team, seeing what they're going through was really hard.
So for you, getting back out and going around visiting sites and being with people physically, it was really important.
Absolutely. I mean, and when I'm with them, I can also see exactly firsthand what's happening and be able to make change that helps them. So,
Faith, one of the other things I want to talk about, something you said to me that I'm afraid I'm going to get this backwards, but I'm going to try to get it right. That when people are angry about change, that they're really grieving loss of what they had before, something like that. How do we recognize that in what we're dealing with right now?
Yeah. So one of the big things is being curious about it. Now I'll clarify too, like sometimes we can be angry about change because the change is bad and we should be angry about it, right? But oftentimes when we feel that like poke, that prick that says like, I'm uncomfortable with this and I'm angry about it, we have to get really curious. Our first step is to get curious about whether what we're experiencing is a primary or a secondary emotion, right? So anger is a secondary emotion, which means that there's always something underneath of it. There's something that's causing the anger. And what we know about anger and fear is that often what's underneath of it is what we know about anger is that often what's underneath of it is fear or grief. And so that's there's this great quote that I'm not sure who said it, but it definitely wasn't me. Like when we sit with our anger long enough, it will tell us its true name, which is almost always grief. And so one of the practices that I have adopted as we're going through some really grief-filled times, and while I'm newer to the company and don't know everyone that is being impacted or all of the changes, doesn't mean that, for those who are newer, that we're not absorbing the atmosphere, right? Or feeling or sensing or picking up or remembering other times where we've experienced that grief. And so I have a box of stones that sits on my desk. And when I feel like that initial like prick of like something is happening, I just pick up a stone and I hold it until I feel like I can come to a place of saying, this is really what's underneath of that. And then at the end of the day, I have my little collection that sits on the desk, right? And I just put them all back for the next day as a way of releasing it.
I feel like I would just end up holding a bunch of stones all day long.
Well, that's why the box is really big.
I don't know if I'd ever really be able to figure out what was bothering me. Got pockets full of stones running around the house.
Right. But just that little tiny pocket of mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is not about always knowing, but it's just making the space to be curious and to wonder about it. And so when we can create, it's a 10-second opening. Like I'm not talking about anything crazy. It's a 10-second opening and like a 90-second questions that I ask myself if something's really crazy has happened, right? That there's little things like that we can do. I'm not suggesting everybody needs a box of rocks on their desk, but if you see a coworker with a box of rocks after this, just be kind about it. And you'll know. Be kind and ask if you can borrow one if you need to, right?
There you go.
That's really
your rocks, people.
In this name it to tame it space, right? And talking about something so we can master it. we have to just create a little bit of margin. And so when Kim's talking about re-implementing practices or blocking things, I know when my day's really stressed that it means that instead of making the choice to do less meditation, it means more, maybe the same time, but more frequently or through different set of different timeline. Nothing needs to be massive or huge to make a significant impact in making sure we can continue on in this both and state. Like if you've watched Inside Out, you know that there's, the sadness marble and the happiness marble. And then we have complex emotions where we have a combination of things. And we're in a state where we're all working, regardless of what the work is, in an environment where there's multiple layers of bittersweet and melancholy and joy and sorrow and excitement and passion for what it is that we do and why we do it.
There's a book that was recommended to me by a friend a couple of years ago. It's called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And it's by Megan Devine. And, to me, as I've been really exploring grief the last couple of years, exploring grief. Wow, that sounds so real. Like as I've been really sad, I just made myself sound like I've been like studying it or something. I haven't been. I've just been experiencing it.
Involuntarily. Too.
Yeah, involuntarily. Yes. It sounded good. But as I've been dealing with grief, I read through this book and I just felt like, oh my gosh, this book sees me. Like it sees a different grief. And one of the biggest takeaways for me is really just our attitude as a society towards grief. And I highlighted one spot that I just wanted to read. And again, this is by Megan Devine and Mark Nepo. It's called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. I highly recommend it. But it says, the thing is, people think the whole point of grief is to get it out as quickly as possible, as if grief were some strange thing, some bizarre and incorrect response to someone or something you love being torn from your life. Grief gets a narrow window to be expressed. After that, you are expected to return to normal, carrying with you the gifts you've learned from the experience. You're supposed to become wiser, more compassionate, and truly understand what's important. Staying sad means you're not doing it right. Our cultural ideas are so deeply embedded that it can be hard to describe how it feels to be on the receiving end of what passes for grief support. We'll get to it. Talks about getting to deal with this more deeply in another part of the book, but it said it's important to state that most people simply stop saying how misunderstood they feel in their grief because it seems no one wants to hear it. We stop saying this hurts because no one listens. And for me, if there's anything that we can do for our people during these hard seasons, and when I say for our people, I mean for our people, for our family, for our friends, it is to not minimize their grief. It is to listen and see them in their grief and in their pain. So, I mean, that's really what I hope from this podcast today, is that people know that if I'm grieving, I can call Faith, Kim, or Jason, and they'll at least listen and they'll see me.
And you're not alone.
Yeah.
No.
Gosh, I think that's a good note to end on. I hope that this has been helpful to some of our EUS team out there. We're all extremely online and connected in the EUS. So, if you have any thoughts or feelings about what we talked about today, drop it in the chat. I always start a new comment thread in Kim's social chat room for the podcast. And so that's a way that you can comment if you want to, or you can email us and let us know what you think. Kim and Faith, thank you so much for joining me today, and you guys have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
You too.
All right. Bye, guys.